folks, it's the first week of January 2025, and welcome to This Week in the West. I'm Seth Spillman, broadcasting from the National Cowboy and Western Heritage Museum in Oklahoma City. On this podcast, we share stories of the people and events that shape the history, art, and culture of the American West, and those still shaping it today. Rarely has anyone suffered as tragic a day as Theodore Roosevelt did on February 14, 1884. Roosevelt was at work as a state legislator when he was summoned home. His mother was dying of typhoid fever, while his wife was still facing a difficult recovery from giving birth a few days before. By the time Roosevelt had returned home, he was able to be with his mother, who succumbed to her disease in the morning. But only a few hours later, his wife would also die, killed by an undiagnosed kidney ailment whose symptoms had been masked by her pregnancy. It was devastating for Roosevelt, who we remember this week on the anniversary of his death, January 6, 1919. In his journal, Roosevelt scrawled a big black X across the top of the page for February 14th with the words, "The light has gone out of my life." A heartbroken Roosevelt searched for a way to recover and rebuild his life. So he headed west. In the summer of 1884, Roosevelt left New York and settled into a low-slung log ranch house near the Little Missouri River, 35 miles north of Medora, North Dakota. Living on the ranch would transform Roosevelt, who'd been known as an elite Gilded Age intellectual, but was always a proponent of the strenuous life as well. He would challenge himself physically, embrace nature, and do hard things. Roosevelt raised cattle and met up with cowboys and Native Americans, some of whom he would later recruit into the Rough Riders unit during the Spanish-American War. It seemed Roosevelt couldn't help but lead, even among the Badlands. He organized other ranchers into the Little Missouri Stockmen's Association to help prevent cattle from overgrazing the land. Ever the hunter, Roosevelt went after bison, bears, and antelope. He later formed the Boone and Crockett Club, which would focus on conserving large game animals. In 1886, he was working as a deputy sheriff of Billings County when he and two of his ranch hands decided to chase down a group of boat thieves. There was still ice in the Little Missouri River when the group set out on a 2-week trek covering 300 miles in the cold of the early spring. They finally tracked down the thieves and turned them over to the authorities. Roosevelt would later say that if it wasn't for his time in North Dakota, he would have never been president. His time there had recalibrated the legendary leader, mending some of the pain he had experienced on that dreaded day a few years before. Roosevelt wrote multiple books about the West and his North Dakota experiences. In one, he shared his feelings of returning to his ranch after a long day. Roosevelt wrote, "There are few moments more pleasant than the homecoming, when, in the gathering darkness, after crossing the last chain of ice-covered buttes, we see through the leafless trees or across the frozen river the red gleam of the firelight as it shines through the ranch windows and flickers over the trunks of the cottonwoods outside, warming a man's blood by the mere hint of the warmth awaiting him within." A brutal winter in 1886 and 87 killed hundreds of thousands of cattle across the plains, including more than 60% of Roosevelt's, in what would be known as the Great Die-Up. Roosevelt had left North Dakota in September 1886 and returned to New York to continue his political ascendance. He'd remarry, become police commissioner of New York City, assistant secretary of the Navy, governor of New York, vice president of the United States, and, with the assassination of William McKinley, president of the United States, all within 15 years of leaving the Badlands, and all before he turned 43. In his book Dreams of El Dorado, A History of the American West, author H.W. Brands wrote that Roosevelt may have left the West, but the West never left him. Brands said, "Roosevelt never lost his emotional connection to the West, nor his belief that the West, for all its ability to shatter dreams, was where the American spirit shone brightest and most true." During his presidency, Roosevelt created the National Park Service, protecting some of the other Western lands like Yellowstone and Yosemite that he had visited. Roosevelt would go on to win re-election, champion the building of the Panama Canal, and run for president a third time under the Progressive or Bull Moose Party. Roosevelt died on January 6, 1919. He was 60. Woodrow Wilson's vice president, Thomas R. Marshall, famously said, "Death had to take Roosevelt sleeping, for if he'd been awake, there would have been a fight." In 1955, Roosevelt was one of the original 5 inductees into our Hall of Great Westerners here at the Cowboy, along with Will Rogers, Charles Goodnight, Charles Russell, and rodeo cowboy Jake McClure. And with that, we'll say bully to this episode of This Week in the West. Our show is produced by Chase Spivey and written by Mike Kaler. Follow us and rate us on Apple Podcasts or wherever you hear us. That'll help us reach more people. You can follow us on social media and online at nationalcowboymuseum.org. Got a question or a suggestion? Drop us an email at podcast@nationalcowboymuseum.org. We leave you today with some more motivational words from Teddy Roosevelt as we charge into a new year. I have never in my life envied a human being who led an easy life. I have envied a great many people who led difficult lives and led them well. Much obliged for listening, and remember, come find your West here at the National Cowboy and Western Heritage Museum.